Look at my poor ex-husband over there. 8 years, and he's still wearing that same worn coat, still standing tucked in the corner like he's waiting for someone to grant him permission to exist." Serafina laughed in the middle of the gala, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Did you invent a life for yourself, Ronan? Some empire nobody's ever seen?" The man in the plain black suit only answered quietly, "It's closer than you think." The whole room laughed. A rich man's son cut in, "So where's the empire, friend? What did you build?" And Ronan replied, mild as a comment about the weather, "You're standing on part of it." She had no idea. She had no idea that the man she was mocking had quietly bought the largest shipping terminals and commercial operations at the port of Boston, out from under 4 of the oldest families on the eastern seaboard: the Cranes, the logistics contracts, and the shipping lanes, all secured under his authority. But the most important person in that room that night wasn't Ronan. It wasn't his ex-wife. It wasn't even the man standing beside her, quietly measuring the silver ring on his hand like an appraiser pricing a thing he intended to steal. The most important person was a waitress in a black apron, carrying a tray of champagne she couldn't afford to spill. Her name was Della, and around her neck, hidden beneath her collar, was a small silver charm, stamped with the very same mark that was worn into the ring of the most powerful man in the room, an invisible thread binding 2 strangers who had no idea it existed. Before the night was over, everything would come apart. If this story touched your heart, leave a like so we know you're listening. Don't forget to share it with someone who needs the reminder that your worth was never measured by anyone else's noise. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story of dignity, kindness, and quiet victories. 3 days before that fateful night, the sky over Boston was covered in an uncertain shade of gray, the color of a morning that still hadn't decided whether it would rain or simply let the clouds pass. And Ronan Gallagher stood silently beside the window of an old shipping office overlooking the harbor, holding a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold, though he had no desire to drink it. Outside, a container ship nearly as long as 2 football fields was slowly easing into the dock, a dock that had become his only that very morning. Maeve found him there, just as she had always found him throughout his entire life. That woman had cared for his grandfather's family and then for him, ever since he was a dirt-smudged little boy racing through the shipyards. And not once in her life had money ever blinded her, whether it belonged to him or to anyone else. She set a cup of hot tea beside his elbow, looked at him with the same expression she had used when he was still a stubborn child, and told him plainly, without wasting a single word, that he would be attending the Brannock Foundation charity gala that Saturday night. Ronan didn't turn around. He merely replied that he already had someone handling it. Maeve gave a quiet laugh, the knowing laugh of someone who had understood him for far too long, and said that he had someone handling everything, and that was precisely the problem. She knew exactly why he needed to be there. For an entire year, Ronan had been quietly following the trail left behind by Theodore Brannock, a name Boston's elite still spoke with the reverence reserved for a generous philanthropist, a man whose photograph regularly appeared beside senators and bishops on the society pages. But that glittering charitable foundation was nothing more than a money-laundering machine, a place where dirty money flowed in from dozens of shadowed corners and emerged clean, dressed in the respectable robes of compassion, while along the way, no small portion of it quietly disappeared into Brannock's own pockets. Ronan had spent an entire year, and no insignificant amount of money assembling the evidence piece by piece, and he was almost at the end. Only one thing remained. One direct thread connecting the man himself to the machine, a confession spoken in Brannock's own voice. Maeve told him that this was exactly why he had to go, because a man like Brannock would lower his guard inside a room filled with applause celebrating him, and Ronan would never have a better chance to get close to the hidden world beneath his polished surface. Then Maeve's voice softened, a rare gentleness that was somehow more unsettling than her usual sharpness. She quietly reminded him that Serafina would be there as well, the woman who had walked away from him on a rainy night 8 years earlier, now standing as the magnificent hostess of the gala and the proud wife of Theodore Brannock. Ronan turned when he heard that name, and for one very brief moment, something old and silent passed across his face before disappearing again. Maeve told him that he should go, not to prove anything to her, because he had moved beyond that long ago, or at least he should have, but because for 8 years he had built this entire empire in the shadows, and she believed there was a part of him that needed to step into its light just once, if only to see with his own eyes that it could stand. Ronan lowered his gaze to the worn silver ring on his right hand, his grandfather's ring, engraved with the Gallagher family crest that had nearly been polished smooth by 3 generations of fingers, and he agreed to go. He didn't know that on that same gray morning, as he scanned the files detailing the loans Brannick had planted throughout every part of his machine, his eyes had already passed over a name buried among hundreds of other anonymous lines, a name that meant nothing to him then, a name he had read and moved beyond without pausing, the name Rourke, and he couldn't have imagined that only 3 days later, that unknown name would walk into his life carrying a tray of champagne. 3 miles south of there, and an entire world away from Ronan's harbor, Della Rourke sat counting in a cramped room on the 3rd floor of an aging building. She had a habit of counting whenever fear grew too large, a habit she had carried since childhood and had never been able to leave behind. And on that Saturday afternoon, she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, counting the money spread across the blanket before her, as though counting it enough times might somehow make it greater than it truly was. But it was never greater. $211, with $900 in rent due in 4 days, and the debt collector's number had already lit up her screen 3 times since noon. Della was 27 years old, and she had learned very early that the world never slowed down for anyone's pain, not for youth, and not for the simple truth that she was doing everything right and it still wasn't enough. Her mother died when Della was 11. Her father held on for another 2 years before the debts and the alcohol became more than he could bear, and then one morning, he simply wasn't there anymore, leaving behind a note shorter than a grocery list. What remained was Della and her little sister, Josie, and Della wanted to remember Josie in the only way that was true, not as the tragedy she had never been, but as the joy she had been entirely on her own. As Josie at 6 years old, standing on a kitchen chair so she could reach the radio and turn it as loud as it would go, while the 2 sisters danced in a kitchen that held almost nothing except them. As Josie naming every pigeon that landed on the windowsill, and swearing she could tell one from another. As Josie drawing the 2 of them as superheroes on the backs of unpaid bills, with Della's cape always made larger because Della was the older sister, and older sisters needed larger capes. That was simply the rule. Josie had been born with a fragile heart, and the care that might have allowed a little girl like her to grow into a full life existed on the other side of walls built from money, walls the Rourke family had never once stood on the right side of. She gave Della 6 years of the purest joy any poor kitchen had ever held. And then, during one quiet winter, she gently slipped away in her sleep, and if there was any mercy in that story, it was that she left peacefully, without pain, dreaming of pigeons and the radio and 2 sisters dancing together. Della was 19 then. She had been Josie's whole world, and Josie had been hers, and afterward the kitchen fell silent, and Della learned what grief eventually teaches everyone, that we never truly move beyond the people we love, we only become better at carrying them with us. And that with time, carrying them stops being only a burden and becomes something almost like companionship. She kept the small piece of silver jewelry, and she still had it now, and on difficult nights she held it in her hand and remembered the dancing instead of the silence. But that grief wasn't what had turned her life from difficult into unbearable. It was the debt left behind by her former husband, Cole, a man who had been warm in the way a warm February day deceives people into leaving their coats at home just before the cold returns to finish them. Cole had borrowed money, then borrowed more to cover what he had already borrowed, and somewhere inside that confusion, he began signing her name beside his own on papers she had never seen, taking money from people whose names appeared nowhere at all, and by the time she understood the shape of what he had done, he had disappeared. He hadn't died. He had simply vanished, exactly as her father had vanished, leaving behind a note and a mountain of debt built by someone else but carved with her name at its foundation. She had fought it one day at a time. She had sat in offices where people explained in weary voices that the debt belonged to her now, that her signature was still her signature whether her own hand had held the pen or not, and she had taken more night shifts, then a second job, then a third, and sold everything that could be sold, while the number at the bottom of the page continued to grow faster than she could ever hope to feed it. But there was one thing the debt couldn't do. One thing nothing in all those years had managed to do. It couldn't make her cruel, because she had decided long ago that kindness was the only ground the world couldn't seize, the only thing that would always remain hers, no matter where her name had been signed. So that evening, when she accepted the serving shift at the Gala only because it paid twice the usual amount, and twice the usual amount was the line between keeping her room and losing it, she stood before the cracked bathroom mirror, straightened the borrowed black uniform, tied back her hair, and quietly slipped her old phone into the pocket of her apron, the way a young woman working alone at night always kept some means of calling for help close to her body. Then she checked the small piece of jewelry hanging from a faded green wool cord, tucked it beneath her collar so it rested against the rhythm of her heart, and stepped outside to catch the bus downtown, never knowing that she was traveling straight toward two men who would tear her life apart. One who would try to bury her, and one who would spend the rest of his life grateful that she had spilled a glass of wine. The ballroom of the Copley Grand Hotel was the kind of room built to make ordinary people feel small, with soaring ceilings hung with crystal chandeliers as large as automobiles, gold leaf covering anything that had remained still long enough, a string quartet playing expensive and forgettable music in one corner, and 800 of Boston's wealthiest people scattered across the floor like ornaments hanging from a Christmas tree, each of them convinced the light had been placed there for them alone. Della moved through the crowd the way water finds its path through stone, patient and invisible, her tray held high, her back straight, her eyes kept soft and fixed on nothing, a trick she had learned so that no important person would ever catch her looking, because the secret to surviving in a room like that was to become part of the furniture, and furniture didn't get shouted at. Furniture kept its job. She had managed for 20 minutes before everything fell apart, and as usual, it wasn't her fault, though that had never meant anything in a room like this. A man in a tuxedo 2 sizes broader than his presence threw out an arm as he laughed, striking the edge of her silver tray with the back of his hand and sending a glass of champagne tipping from its polished surface, spilling straight down the front of the woman beside him. A woman wrapped in silver silk that probably cost more than Della earned in an entire season. The room did what rooms like that always did. It turned. The woman shrieked, asking whether Della was blind, whether they hired absolutely anyone now, holding the ruined silk away from her body as though it were bleeding, demanding to know whether Della had any idea how much it cost. Of course she didn't. One only had to look at her to know that. Della said she was terribly sorry, her voice steady, because she had learned how to keep her voice steady no matter what was happening behind it, and told the woman to let her bring something to clean it. But the woman cut her off and asked what Della planned to do, repay her, before letting out a short, ugly laugh, while the man who had actually caused the accident had already disappeared into the crowd, leaving Della alone inside an ever-widening circle of onlookers, the silver tray trembling faintly in her hand. The woman, now aware that she had an audience and beginning to enjoy herself, went on to say that people like Della drifted through rooms like this without even understanding where they were, that this wasn't her world, sweetheart, and someone should have told her that before she ever came through the door. Della said nothing, because there was nothing she could say without losing the shift, and the shift was rent, and the rent was the room, and the room was the last 4 walls in the world that still belonged to her. So she lowered her eyes and endured it, as she had endured so many things, and waited for it to pass. It was a voice behind her that brought it all to an end, and that was what she would remember forever afterward, because in a room filled with people performing at the very limits of their voices, that voice never rose at all. It was low and unhurried and utterly certain, and somehow it passed through everything like a hand parting water, saying that the gentleman in the ill-fitting tuxedo was the one who had knocked over the tray, that he had seen it with his own eyes, that she had spent 30 seconds humiliating a woman for another man's mistake in front of a room that now understood exactly what kind of person she was, and that if he were her, he would stop speaking now, because she wasn't improving her position in the slightest. Della turned. The man standing behind her wasn't tall in any showy way, but looking at him, one understood that he occupied exactly as much space as he intended to, and not an inch more. His dark hair neatly cut, a simple black suit so perfectly fitted that every other man in the room appeared to be wearing a costume, a faint scar crossing one eyebrow, and eyes as gray as a harbor in November, calm and cold, fixed on the woman with a degree of attention that had silenced people far harder than she was. The woman opened her mouth, looked into his face, and closed it again. He didn't bother to glance at Della even once. He simply turned, unhurried, and walked back into the shadows at the edge of the room, and the circle of staring people broke apart and gathered somewhere else, and the moment was over. But in the half-second as he turned away, Della had seen his right hand. She had seen the ring upon it, plain silver, worn smooth by the years, and engraved across its face was a small shape, a pattern so distinct that she had traced it with her fingertips 10,000 times on a faded green wool cord, a shape a little girl named Josie had once called a flower in the cold kitchen of a life that now seemed impossibly far away. And Della stood frozen in the most magnificent room in Boston, the silver tray forgotten in her hand, feeling the floor beneath everything she believed she understood about the world tilt quietly under her feet. For one moment, Della was no longer standing in the ballroom. She had returned to a small kitchen from more than a decade earlier, where a woman she could now remember only dimly, her grandmother, sat at the table beneath a weak yellow light, her aged hands trembling as she tied a green wool cord around Josie's tiny wrist. Della had still been a child then, standing quietly beside them and watching, while Josie giggled because the wool tickled her skin, lifting her wrist and turning it in circles so the little piece of silver jewelry could catch the light, and their grandmother had closed her wrinkled hand around the child's small fingers and spoken in a voice Della had been too young to preserve completely. All she had kept was the feeling of it, the sound of something both sorrowful and sacred. Her grandmother told them that the piece of jewelry had come into their family during a brutal winter many years before, a winter when their family had stood on the edge of losing everything, when the cold had worked its way into their bones, when there was nothing left in the house to burn and nothing left to eat, and that in the middle of that winter, when it seemed certain to swallow the entire family, a stranger had appeared. She never clearly spoke his name, because he had never left one behind, and that seemed to be the very thing she remembered most, the way one person could enter the darkest moment of another person's life, do what he had done, and then quietly disappear without leaving anything except a small piece of silver, and the feeling that the world could sometimes, almost impossibly, be kind for no reason at all. She described him with a sentence her young granddaughter had carved into her memory even after all the words around it had faded, a sentence spoken with equal parts wonder and gratitude, saying that he had been a hard man who had done a gentle thing. A hard man who had done a gentle thing. Della hadn't understood it then. She had stored the sentence away beside all the other things adults said that were too large for a child to carry, and then she had forgotten it, almost, through all the years she spent struggling against the cold and rain of her own life. Her grandmother passed away not long after that winter, and then her mother, then her father, and then Josie too, until the silver jewelry on its green wool cord became the only thing left from an entire line of people who had once loved her, and she had worn it against the beating of her heart for 8 long years without ever truly wondering what the strange pattern carved into it meant, because to her it had never been a symbol. It was only Josie, only the dancing in the kitchen, only a tiny wrist turning in circles beneath the yellow light. But now, standing frozen in the ballroom, while the music of the string quartet seemed to drift toward her from some distant place, Della felt that sentence rise inside her chest, like something awakened from a long sleep. Because the pattern wasn't an ordinary design sold in 1,000 stores. It wasn't merely similar. It was the same, with that peculiar unevenness, the small notch along one edge, the surface worn smooth by time, something so distinctive that it couldn't possibly be a coincidence, and now it rested on the hand of a man in an expensive suit, standing among the wealthiest people in Boston. She wondered how a stranger could be wearing what Josie had called her little flower, how the shape Della had held close through every year of suffering, the shape bound to her dead sister, and to the grandmother who had once spoken of nameless kindness during a distant winter, could appear here tonight on the hand of the only man in the entire room who had just used his power to defend a waitress he didn't know and never expected to see again. Somewhere inside her, a door that had remained tightly closed since the day she stood in a hospital corridor 8 years earlier, holding the small piece of silver a nurse had just returned to her, shifted softly upon its hinges, and Della, who had learned to trust the quiet voice that had always kept her alive, knew only one thing amid all her confusion. Though she couldn't yet understand what any of it meant, the silent man in the black suit had unknowingly reached out and touched the deepest wound in her heart. Not far away, Serafina Voss had recognized him. For 8 years, she hadn't laid eyes on that man, and the reason she could stand there mocking him, the reason not one of the powerful people filling that room understood who the man lingering quietly in the corner truly was, lay in the fact that Ronan Gallagher had never been a name made for the light. He ran everything from behind the curtain, through intermediaries, through layers of shell companies stacked one upon another, and his face had never appeared on a single newspaper page. All of Boston had been buzzing that week over the largest port acquisition in the city's history, but every report spoke only of an anonymous buyer and an undisclosed transaction, so no one in the ballroom could connect that earth-shaking news to the quiet man in the black suit whom they had been told, only an hour earlier, was nothing more than a nobody wearing rented clothes. Serafina saw him, and recognition moved across her face in stages, first confusion, then certainty, then a cruel, radiant delight, as though someone had just handed her a gift. She called his name loudly enough to make heads turn, because she had always wanted heads to turn, and she crossed the floor toward him with an entire circle of admirers trailing behind her, because people like Serafina always traveled with an audience the way other people carried luggage. She introduced him to the group as though presenting some relic from her past, her first husband, if they could believe such a thing, from the days before she had known any better. A dock worker. No, actually, his grandfather had been the dock worker, while Ronan had mostly carried freight and dreamed grand dreams, and she looked him up and down, appraising his suit and misjudging its value by a factor of 40. Someone laughed. People always laughed. A room like that was dry timber, and cruelty was a struck match. The only question was how quickly the fire would spread. Serafina asked whether he was still at the docks, whether he was still hauling cargo for other men, or whether those grand dreams of his had finally agreed to grow up. Then she asked whether he had married, whether there was anyone in his life, or whether it was still only him, that pitiful little ring, and whatever he told himself at night. The circle laughed on cue. A wealthy young man with a senator's haircut and the confidence of a hedge fund decided to join in, reminding everyone that Ronan used to go on and on about building an empire. Wasn't that the story? The man who was going to create something great? Then he looked Ronan over and found exactly what he expected to find, which was the greatest weakness of people who only ever saw what they anticipated. And he asked what Ronan had built, then, and where his empire was. Ronan answered, as lightly as though he were commenting on the weather, that they were standing on part of it, and the sentence passed completely over their heads, the way truth so often does when it is spoken too plainly to a room that has already decided a man is a joke. They heard it as bragging, as the pathetic vanity of someone reaching desperately for something to say, and the wealthy young man laughed the loudest, clapped a hand against Serafina's shoulder, and told her that Ronan was good. No wonder she had kept him around as a story. What none of them could see was that Ronan wasn't being modest. He was speaking literally. The floor beneath their feet belonged to a building whose underlying land deed he controlled. The harbor glittering beyond those tall windows moved across waters he had just purchased outright. He could have said so and watched their laughter die, but he chose the deeper pleasure of letting them continue, because a man who understood exactly what he possessed didn't need an entire room to understand it with him. And that was the difference between power and the performance of power, a difference Serafina had never been able to recognize throughout their marriage, and still couldn't recognize 8 years later. He merely told her that it was good to see her again, Sarah, and that she looked well, and those words landed more heavily than any insult could have, because she had wanted an argument, and an argument would have meant that he still cared. But what she received instead was the calm, indifferent courtesy of a man to whom she had become genuinely small, and for one brief second, behind the delight in her eyes, something flickered that looked almost like fear. That was when her husband spoke. Theodore Brannock, larger than he appeared in photographs and softer too, a carefully groomed, heavy-set man who wore his expensive suit more like a declaration than a possession, and he stepped forward, placing a proprietary hand against Serafina's back before speaking in the overly warm voice of someone who had never once been the most dangerous man in any room, and had therefore never learned how to recognize when he was standing before one. But the instant he began speaking, Della, watching from a distance, saw his gaze fall from Ronan's face to his right hand, to the ring, and he didn't look at it the way a man looks at something that interests him. He looked at it the way an appraiser looks at an estate, the way a man who converts everything he sees into numbers looks at a number he intends to collect. It happened quickly. He must have believed no one noticed. Then he leaned toward a thin man standing at the edge of the group and whispered something into his ear. And Della watched the thin man slip away from the crowd, moving toward a side door with his phone already pressed against his ear. The rain began falling sometime around 10 o'clock, tapping softly against the tall glass windows. And as rain had always done, it carried Ronan back to the worst night of his former life. 8 years had passed, but the human body remembers the weather, and he had been 26 then, standing beneath the useless awning of an aging 3-story building in South Boston, soaked through to the skin, watching Serafina place 2 suitcases into the trunk of a car belonging to a man whose name he didn't yet know and wouldn't learn until many years later. She hadn't shouted, and that was what made it memorable. She had been almost gentle as she did it, in the way people are gentle when they have already left in every way that matters, and only their body remains to be moved. She told him that he was a good man, Ronan, without a trace of malice, the rain plastering her hair against her face, but that he would never become anything, and she couldn't waste an entire lifetime waiting for the day she discovered she had been right. At that time, he had only $400 to his name, a grandfather who had been buried 3 months earlier, and the old man's set of tools, which Ronan sold that very week to repay a debt that hadn't even been his. He had stood in that rain watching the taillights recede into the distance, and he had made himself a promise he had kept every day since. The promise wasn't that he would become rich, nor was it that he would make her regret leaving him. It was quieter and colder than that, and it had driven his life like a machine ever since that night. He would build something so solid that no one, ever again, would have the right to decide for him what he was worth. He would never tell anyone what came afterward. The long years spent in darkness, the choices a much better man would have made differently, and the choices a much weaker man could never have made at all, because that wasn't the part worth telling now. What was worth telling was that he had built it, and it stood, and every stone of it had been bound together by the same cold vow he had made in the rain, that no one would ever be allowed to place a value upon him again, and that vow had worked exactly as it was meant to work. It had made him powerful, and safe, and impossible to touch. But as he stood in the ballroom 8 years later, watching the same rain fall against a different pane of glass, he waited for the old wound to rise again, the wound he had carried all those years like an engine, and he was genuinely surprised to realize that it had closed, quietly, at some point without his noticing. The woman who had told him in the rain that he would never become anything now stood only a few steps away, having just delivered enough mockery to set an entire room ablaze, and he looked at her and felt nothing but a steady stillness, the stillness of a man to whom she had become truly small, not because he was forcing himself to see her that way, but because she had simply stopped mattering. He had once imagined that the day he saw her again would feel like victory, that he would taste the sweetness of proving her wrong, but standing there beneath the crystal light, with the rain tapping softly outside, he understood something stranger than victory. He didn't need to prove anything to her at all. That need had faded long ago, like a fever slowly breaking in the night, and perhaps the empire he had built had never truly made him worthy. It had only made him safe, while worth was something else entirely, something he still couldn't name. It was in the middle of that slow moment, while he stood alone with the rain and the wound that had finally healed, that his eyes found the waitress from earlier again, the woman in the black apron now standing near the edge of the room beside the staff entrance, and she wasn't working. She stood perfectly still, in exactly the way he himself stood still, the way people stand when every part of their attention has narrowed to a single point. And that single point, he realized with a flicker of confusion, was his hand, his ring, and there was none of the calculation on her face that he had grown so accustomed to seeing in rooms like this. There was only raw and bewildered recognition, and beneath it, something that looked, impossibly, exactly like grief. Della needed some air. Both things had descended upon her at once, the humiliation still burning against her skin, and the shock of the pattern on the ring still spinning through her mind, until the 4 magnificent walls of the ballroom suddenly felt so suffocating that she couldn't draw another breath beneath those crystal chandeliers. So she slipped through the service corridor, past the steaming clamor of the kitchen, and pushed open the heavy door leading to the loading area behind the hotel, out into the cold, the smell of rain, and the blessed absence of chandeliers. She leaned back against the damp brick wall and breathed, her hands trembling, not because of the woman wrapped in silver silk, because she had endured 100 women wrapped in silver silk, but because of the ring. She pulled the little piece of jewelry from beneath her collar and held it up beneath the thin light spilling through the doorway, staring at the small pattern she knew by heart through her fingertips, and she was drowning in the question of how a stranger could possibly wear Josie's flower on his hand when she heard voices. 2 men had stepped out at the far end of the loading area, about 30 paces away, sheltered beneath an awning, and they didn't see her standing in the darkness beside the door, because Brannick had chosen exactly the kind of corner a man like him always chose when he wanted to say things no one was meant to hear, a corner he was certain was empty. Della didn't recognize one of them, a thin man holding a phone, the same man who had slipped from the ballroom at Brannick's signal moments earlier, but she had served the other one wine an hour before. Large, polished, expensive, the husband of the woman in silver silk, the man she had heard someone call Brannick. She should have gone back inside. She knew that even as she remained perfectly still, but then the thin man spoke a word that crossed the damp courtyard and tightened around her throat, whispering urgently about the Rourke loan, saying that Brannick wanted the flagged accounts removed before the audit, that the loan was a problem. Brannick cut him off and told him not to say names out there, then asked how much remained, and the thin man answered that after the predatory interest, the debtor would never be able to repay it. But that was exactly what Brannick wanted. He had told them to keep it that way. Brannick said he knew what he had told them, then a lighter sparked in the darkness, and he ordered the man to bury it in the scholarship fund's budget line with the others, saying that if anyone followed the thread, it would look like a defaulted scholarship, and no one audited a dead scholarship. Della stood in the darkness with her sister's jewelry biting into the palm of her clenched hand and her own name hanging in the damp air, and she understood two things at once, coldly and completely, the way someone understands they have just stepped into the path of oncoming traffic. The first was that the debt that had devoured 3 years of her life, the debt her former husband had forged her name onto before disappearing beneath it, the debt she had been told again and again simply belonged to her now, indisputable as the weather, had never been weather at all. It was a design. Someone had built it, and the man who had built it was standing 30 paces away in a tuxedo, discussing her ruin the way other men discussed the weather, folding it up and hiding it inside a charity created in the name of children. She realized that what had happened to her was happening to others, that children's names were being used as a screen to conceal a wealthy man's theft, scholarships that had been promised and then stolen, accounts hollowed out so dirty money could be washed clean. The second thing she understood was that she was standing alone in the darkness, unseen, without a single piece of steel in her hand, listening to a powerful man confess to a crime he would be willing to kill to keep silent, and between her and those two men, there were only 3 meters of darkness. Every instinct Della had built through 27 years of survival told her to leave, to slip back through the door, to become furniture again, to lower her head and keep her name out of the mouths of dangerous men, because that was how someone like her had managed to stay alive this long, by never, ever becoming important enough to be worth destroying. She had seen with her own eyes what happened to people who became important to men like Brannick, and now she was holding the very evidence that could make her important in that deadly way, digging deep into the palm of her hand. But that word still hung in the damp air, the word the thin man had let slip before hurriedly swallowing it back, and beneath it were the other words, scholarship fund. No one audits a dead scholarship, keep them that way. And Della, standing in the darkness, made the calculation Brannick, in all his arrogance, had never imagined a waitress could make. A dead scholarship meant a child had once been promised something and then had it stolen away. A scholarship fund meant children, plural, and keep them that way meant keep them poor, keep them drowning, trapped in the same place where she had been kept, the same place where Cole's borrowed money and her forged signature had held her down, and she understood in one cold flash that whatever had happened to her was happening to other people, was happening now, to children whose names were being used as camouflage for a rich man's theft, and that she was the only person in the world standing in the darkness with her finger beside the button. She thought of Josie. She thought of the care that had existed on the other side of walls built from money, the side the Rourke family had never once stood on. She thought of all the powerful people who had passed through her life and done things to her, and she thought of the promise she had made to herself in a hospital corridor 8 years earlier, that if she were ever given the chance to stand between someone like that and someone smaller, she would take it, no matter what it cost, because someone should have done that for Josie, and no one had. Now the chance had come, and it had come the way important chances always seem to come, at the worst possible moment, with no weapon in her hand, alone, in the rain. She stood there and felt fear clearly winning the argument it was winning, felt her heart pounding so hard she was afraid the two men might hear it, felt every safe exit in her life calling her back inside, and she thought perhaps she wasn't brave enough. She would tell the world that she hadn't been brave, even though she was the bravest person in that entire building that night. She only knew that standing in the rain with her dead sister's name in the mouth of a criminal, she was tired of always being something powerful people could act upon as they pleased, and that just once, in one cold minute on that loading dock, she had the chance to become something that could act in return. So, very slowly, refusing to let herself think too much, before fear could win the last part of the argument, Della slipped one hand into the pocket of her apron, found the old phone, and pressed the button she knew by the feel of her fingertip, the button that began recording. The phone silently captured every word. The two men kept talking, and 3 meters of darkness were all that stood between Della Rourke and the end of everything, because she knew that one turn of Brannick's head, one careless sweep of the thin man's eyes toward the doorway where she was hiding, would mean this night would no longer be the night she saved unknown children, But the night she became the next name buried in some line of a budget, and she tightened her hand around Josie's jewelry, held her breath, and stayed, while Della held her breath in the darkness beyond the loading dock. Inside the ballroom, the room had begun, very slowly, to rearrange itself around the man standing in the corner, exactly as his grandfather had once promised it would. The first sign was the hotel manager, an elegant and perpetually anxious man named Fitch, who ran the Copley Grand and who, several months earlier, had been quietly informed of the identity of the man who held the deed to the very land beneath his hotel. Fitch had spent the entire evening pretending not to know that Ronan was there, in accordance with Ronan's long-standing wishes, but sometime around 11 o'clock, some instinct for self-preservation finally overcame his caution, and he crossed the ballroom in full view of everyone, inclined his head slightly, and asked in a voice loud enough for those nearby to hear whether Mr. Gallagher found everything satisfactory, whether there was anything at all, that the Grand could do for him personally, tonight or at any other time. People noticed immediately when the man who ran the entire building bowed before someone standing in the corner. The circle around Serafina shifted uneasily, whispers began, and the name Gallagher, which only an hour earlier had been a source of amusement, now passed from mouth to ear, with a growing sense of confusion. The second sign was the city government. Among the guests that evening were a deputy mayor, 2 members of the Port Authority, and a real estate developer whose towers were rising on 3 separate parcels along Boston Harbor, and one by one, over the course of roughly 20 minutes, each of them found his way to Ronan's corner to offer the respect they couldn't afford not to show. They didn't do it loudly, because truly powerful people rarely did, but they did it openly, one after another, a quiet procession of the city's real power crossing a crowded ballroom to stand for a moment in the presence of the man most of the guests had just been told was nothing more than a nobody in a rented suit. The deputy mayor shook his hand with both of his own and said something about how fortunate the city was. One of the port officials leaned closer as though presenting himself for inspection, and the real estate developer, a man accustomed to entire rooms bending toward him, stood before Ronan with the posture of someone who had come to ask for favor. Ronan received all of it in the same way he received everything, calmly, without any visible pleasure. A nod here, a low reply there, not a single expression suggesting that he had noticed an entire room reorganizing itself around him. But Serafina noticed. She was still standing near the center of the floor, still trying to hold on to her circle of admirers, and he could see the exact moment the whispers reached her, see her turn, follow the deputy mayor's deferential body language across the room, toward its destination, and find him. Boston Harbor had filled the newspapers all week. The historic acquisition, the anonymous buyer, the largest private transaction in the city's history, and she must have read it. Everyone in that room had read it. And now Ronan watched Serafina Voss stand in the middle of her own gala and finally understand that the anonymous buyer, the man who now owned the very waters upon which her husband's entire fortune floated, was the dock worker she had abandoned in the rain because he would never become anything. He watched the story spread through the ballroom like oil across water, watched it reach every face that had laughed at him an hour earlier, watched the laughter curdle into an awkward silence, and he felt no triumph at all. Only the familiar stillness of a man who had known exactly what he possessed long before the room managed to understand it. The blood had drained from Serafina's face, and in that very moment, while the attention of the entire ballroom gathered around him like a rising tide, Ronan's gaze didn't linger on his former wife. Instead, it moved beyond the crowd toward the service door, searching for the woman in the black apron, with his ancestor's ring hidden beneath her collar, and when he saw that she was no longer there, something inside him, something he still couldn't name, tightened softly with concern. Serafina approached him for the second time that night, and this time she walked very differently. Gone was the theatrical poise of a woman dragging an audience behind her. What remained was simply a woman struggling to keep her legs steady while the ground beneath her dissolved, and when she stopped in front of him, every trace of delight had vanished from her face, replaced by something raw that had always been hiding beneath the performance she had maintained for the past 8 years. She said his name, and it sounded strange falling from her lips. Then she asked about the harbor, asked whether it could truly have been him, whether he was the anonymous buyer, whether it had been him all along. He merely replied that it was good to see her again, Sarah, exactly as he had said before, and the repetition fell between them like a closing door, because she understood, and he knew she understood, that she had nothing left to say that he would care to hear. She performed again the calculation she had gotten so catastrophically wrong only an hour earlier, connecting the news that had filled the papers all week with the man before whom the city's most powerful figures had just bowed one after another, and the final number that emerged drained the blood from her face. She understood that the dock worker she had abandoned in the rain because he would never become anything now controlled the very waters upon which her second husband's entire fortune floated, that the empire she had mocked only an hour before was real, complete, and standing between her entire life and the floor beneath her feet. She opened her mouth, and for the first time in the 8 years he had known her, and perhaps for the first time in her entire life, Serafina Voss couldn't find a single word to say. But he was no longer truly looking at her, because behind her, across the room, he had just caught sight of Brannick, and Brannick wasn't making that same calculation. Brannick was already several steps ahead of it. His thin associate had returned to his side and whispered something into his ear, and Ronan watched the large, polished philanthropist turn a sickly shade of gray that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a fear far older and far simpler. A man didn't panic in the presence of a business rival. He panicked in the presence of the one person who could prove what he had done. The name Gallagher meant something to him now, and he understood that Ronan's presence there that night wasn't an accident, that the man before whom the entire room had just bowed was also the man toward whom every hidden road beneath his filthy empire was leading. Brannick set down his glass, said something to Serafina that she didn't hear because she was still standing frozen, staring at Ronan, then began moving toward the exit with the horrifying false casualness of a man trying not to run. He tried to keep his steps even, tried to smile at one or two guests along the way as though nothing were wrong, but Ronan saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked toward the doors, and then back toward him, the way an animal looks when it realizes the cage it had mistaken for a castle has already closed. Ronan caught Fitch's eye from across the room. He did nothing as crude as nod. He simply held the hotel manager's gaze for a moment, and allowed him to understand that the man attempting to leave shouldn't find leaving easy, and Fitch, who very much wanted to keep the land beneath his hotel, quietly drifted toward the doors ahead of Brannick, with the 2 largest security officers at the Grand falling into step behind him. Serafina remained standing there amid the first ruins of her world, still unable to grasp everything unfolding around her, only dimly sensing that the night she had created so she could shine was collapsing into something she could no longer control. And Ronan looked at her one final time, without resentment, without pity, only with the steady gaze reserved for someone who had become completely unimportant, and then he turned away, because there was someone else in that building he needed to find, the woman in the black apron who had disappeared from the edge of the room, and with every second that passed without him seeing her, the knot of worry inside his chest tightened a little more. She appeared at his elbow from nowhere, moving in the quiet way she had taught herself to move, carrying a glass of ice water on a tray, so that for one bewildering second he thought she was simply doing her job. Then she spoke, low and urgent, without looking toward him, her eyes fixed on some distant point in the way a woman speaks when she can't allow anyone to see that she is speaking at all. She told him that the man trying to leave, Brannick, was on a recording she had, from only moments ago outside the loading area. He had named it, The Fraud, the way he buried it inside a fund meant for children. He had said it in his own voice. Her voice trembled, but her words didn't. She said she didn't know who Ronan was. She only knew that everyone in the room was bowing before him, and she knew Brannick was about to walk through those doors while she was holding the one thing that could stop him. But she had no way to make anyone believe the word of a waitress, so she was giving it to the only person in the building whom Brannick was truly afraid of. At last, she turned to look at him, and her eyes were wet and furious and completely steady as she begged him not to let Brannick bury it, begged him to understand that this wasn't only about money, that Brannick was doing it with children's names on those accounts, that there were children involved, please. Throughout his life, Ronan had been handed many things by frightened people, but no one had ever placed in his hands what this woman had just given him in those 30 seconds. It wasn't a bribe, or a plea for her own safety, or some calculated scheme. It was a weapon, freely surrendered against the most powerful man in the room by the least powerful person within it, for no reason except that it was the right thing to do and she was the only one who had been in a position to do it. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the thing he had felt stirring inside his chest from across the ballroom an hour earlier shifted and became something he still had no name for. He asked her name, and it wasn't merely a question. He needed to know it. She told him Della Rourke. Rourke, the name he had read 100 times in Brannick's loan files without ever stopping, the dead scholarship, the buried account, the design someone had deliberately created. now had a face, and that face stood before him in a borrowed uniform, having just handed him the final thread he needed to hang Teddy Brannick, without knowing that her own destruction had been written 3 lines below it in the same file. In that instant, he understood that this woman had existed inside his investigation for an entire year, without either of them knowing it, that the crime he had come there to prove, and the debt, strangling the life out of her, were the same crime, that the universe, a universe he had never believed possessed any feeling at all, had arranged for the victim of a criminal and the man who would judge that criminal to meet because of a spilled glass of champagne. But behind her, across the ballroom, Teddy Brannick had nearly reached the doors, and Ronan knew he had only seconds left. He took the glass of ice water from her tray, giving her a believable reason to have stopped beside him, then told her, so quietly that only she could hear, that she had done the right thing, that Brannick wouldn't bury anything, that she must keep the phone safe and give it to no one except him, and that from this moment forward, she didn't need to be afraid anymore. She looked at him, and there was a question in her eyes she hadn't yet dared to speak, the question of how the ring on his hand could bear her sister's flower. But this wasn't the time, and she understood that, so she only nodded faintly, tightened her hand around the apron pocket where the phone was hidden, and stepped back as Ronan turned toward the doors, where Teddy Brannick had just reached the handle and discovered that the exit was filled with large, courteous men who were deeply apologetic but regrettably compelled to ask him to remain. While Fitch's men closed in around Brannick at the doorway, Ronan's mind was moving faster than the events unfolding before him, fitting the name that had just fallen from Della's lips into its proper place among the files he had studied for the past year. Rourke. The name he had passed over 100 times as one anonymous line among hundreds of others, the name that had never belonged to a face, suddenly had one now, and that face was standing directly before him, exhausted and upright and impossibly kind, and he understood with cold certainty that the woman who had just handed him the final thread he needed to bring Brannick down was one of the very victims whose name he had read months earlier and passed without stopping. The debt strangling her wasn't some accidental burden. It was the Rourke loan the thin man had mentioned outside the loading area, the loan deliberately structured so it could never be repaid, the loan buried inside the budget line of a scholarship fund so it would appear to be a dead scholarship, which meant the machine that had crushed 3 years of her life and the machine he had come there to dismantle were one and the same, operated by the same hand. He would carry that truth with him for a long time. The knowledge that he had held her fate in his hands months earlier, had read her name on paper and failed to stop, while she had been slowly dying beneath the weight of that very line without ever knowing that somewhere, a man had read it and might have been able to save her. But even as that realization surged through him, something else seized his attention more powerfully, something that had lodged in his mind from the moment he saw her standing still at the edge of the room, the way her hand had kept pressing unconsciously against her collarbone throughout the evening, against something hidden beneath her collar. He told her quietly to show him the object she was wearing around her neck, the piece of jewelry. She hesitated, a stranger making a strange request in the middle of the chaos rising around them, but something in his face must have told her that it wasn't in order, and she drew it out from beneath her collar on its faded green wool cord and held it between them. And for one long moment, the man before whom the entire room had just bowed, the man who had allowed his former wife to stand pale and speechless without striking back, the man who now held the freedom of the second most powerful man in the room in his hands, stood motionless, staring at a tiny piece of silver hanging from a cheap cord, and the color left his face. The stillness he had built over 8 years, the stillness that had endured Serafina's mockery, Brannick's appraisal, and an entire procession of the city's power without so much as a ripple, broke for one brief moment when his eyes found the small pattern engraved into the silver. That peculiar asymmetry, the notch along one edge, the surface worn smooth by time, a shape he had traced 10,000 times on his own ring, a shape carved into a gravestone in a cold South Boston cemetery, a shape he knew better than his own face. He said nothing. That was what frightened her, the sudden silence, the way his entire being gathered into a single point and froze there without a word. She asked him what it was, why it was on his hand, her voice growing softer and beginning to tremble, but Ronan only looked from the silver in her hand to the ring on his own, and then back again, and something passed across his face that she couldn't understand, something that looked like pain and wonder at once, as though 20 years and 2 lost generations had just closed into a perfect circle in the center of his palm. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as though what he was about to say was too large to be spoken in the middle of a room collapsing around them. And at last all he could manage was that this wasn't the time. That he would tell her everything, but not here. Not tonight amid all of this, and that she needed to trust him one more time, only once more, and hold tightly to that piece of silver, because it had turned out to matter far more than she had ever known. Ronan let Della retreat to the safety of the room's edge, then crossed the ballroom toward the doors, slowly and without haste. The way he did everything, watching the scene unfold as a man watches a wave he set in motion finally reach the shore. Brannock stood at the threshold, arrested in mid-step, the calculating look of an animal passing briefly across his carefully groomed face as he realized the exit was crowded with men who weren't members of the serving staff. He turned, searching for another way out, and found Ronan already watching him from across the room. And for one long moment, the magnificent ballroom seemed to narrow until nothing remained except the line of sight between them, the philanthropist and the man who controlled his waters, the thief and the ledger of debts. And Brannock understood, Ronan thought, in that very instant, just how completely he had lost, because Ronan saw the force leave his shoulders and something older and heavier descend to take its place. He approached Ronan instead of the door, naturally, because men like Brannock always believed there was still some arrangement left to bargain for until the exact moment everything closed around them, because their entire lives had taught them that everything could be bought, and every man had a price. He lowered his voice, the warm voice of high society now gone completely, leaving only a frightened, heavy-set man inside an expensive suit, and said that whatever Ronan thought he had, whatever this was, there was still a version of that night in which both of them behaved more wisely, that Ronan was a businessman, that he was a businessman too, and that Ronan should name his price. Ronan replied that he wasn't a businessman, that this was the mistake everyone in the room had made that night, and it was the final mistake Brannock would be permitted to make. He allowed the words to settle for a moment, then continued, saying that Brannock had built a machine designed to drown poor people and hide them inside a charity for children, that Ronan had spent an entire year in the darkness, taking that machine apart piece by piece, and that 1 hour earlier, he had still been missing the final piece. He glanced only once toward the service door, where a woman in a black apron stood watching with her heart caught in her throat, then said that a woman Brannock had never once bothered to see had given him that piece, freely, without asking for anything in return, that there was no price. Teddy, that Brannock had spent his whole life believing everyone had one, and now he would spend the rest of it learning that the very people he had stepped on to climb this high were the ones who couldn't be bought. Brannock stared at him, and for one mad moment, the fear on his face hardened into something ugly, the instinct of a cornered man preparing to strike, and one of Fitch's 2 security officers quietly moved half a step forward. Only half a step, enough to remind him that the room no longer belonged to him. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no shouting, no raised hand, only the slow and immovable closing of a trap already sprung, as Fitch and his men surrounded Brannock at the threshold, courteous and unyielding, and the last of his false composure finally fell away. Serafina had drifted close enough to hear the final part of it all, and Ronan watched her look from him to her husband and back again, watched her finally understand the full structure of the night, that the man she had abandoned in the rain now held her husband's freedom inside a file, that the empire she had mocked only an hour earlier was real and complete, and standing between her entire life and the floor beneath her feet. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Ronan said nothing more to him and nothing more to her, because he had stopped caring about both of them long ago. He simply took out his phone and made 3 calls, his voice low and brief, and the machinery of an ending began to move. The people he had summoned started entering through the doors, and he turned his back on Teddy Brannock, because the man was no longer anything worth looking at, and went in search of the only person in the room he still wanted to see. But it didn't unfold smoothly, and he would never pretend that it did, because there was a stretch of roughly 3 days, during which he came closer to losing everything that mattered than he had at any time since that rainy night 8 years earlier, and during which Della came close to something even worse. A man like Teddy Brannock didn't simply collapse when the doors closed in front of him. He had been detained that night, yes, kept in place by Fitch's large and courteous men until the people Ronan had called arrived to make the evening official. But holding a man for an hour wasn't the same as locking him away, and by dawn, the lawyers had gotten him out, and by noon, he had made the calculation panicked. Men always make too late, that no waitress's phone should ever have been present outside the loading dock that night, that the recording, which had reached the authorities with a speed too precise to be accidental, must have come from somewhere, and that source had a face he had seen carrying champagne, and that face bent over a loan file beneath a name he knew well: Rourke. There was one thing Ronan had learned about powerful men who built their power by hurting those who couldn't fight back. When they were finally cornered, their first instinct was never to save themselves. It was to punish the person who had dared to stop being furniture. Brannock would eventually go to prison, and some part of him already understood that. But before he went, he wanted the woman who had brought him down to understand that people like her weren't permitted to do such things to people like him without paying a price. Ronan learned that Brannock had sent men to her building because Della herself called him, and that was the first miracle of those 3 days, that she called him, that in the worst moment she reached for the dangerous stranger instead of running away, that some hidden ledger deep inside her had decided he was safety before either of them had done anything to deserve that word. Her voice on the phone was very calm and very quiet, and he would come to understand that this was how Della sounded when she was most afraid. She told him that 2 men had been sitting in a car across the street from her building for more than an hour, that one of them had come to the diner where she worked the morning shift and asked the manager in a friendly voice whether Della still lived at the same address, that she had seen enough to understand what was happening, but she wasn't calling for him to rescue her. She told him she wasn't a charity project. She was calling because he knew things about that man that she didn't, and she needed to understand what she was facing, and he was the only living person who would tell her the truth instead of telling her to calm down. He had never ended a call and moved so quickly in his life. He wouldn't recount the details of what happened next, because one part of him wasn't the part worth offering as a lesson to anyone, and because those details belonged to the world his grandfather had built and he was slowly dismantling. He would only say this much, that the 2 men outside Della's building disappeared within an hour, and they didn't return, and by the time they left, they understood exactly whose harbor they had been standing on, and what it cost to point their car towards something that belonged to him. He did it without allowing her to see. He did it the way the old man would have done it, quietly, completely, then erased every trace of it, so that all Della knew was that the street across from her building was empty when she looked again, and remained empty. And when she asked him what had happened, he only told her that it had been handled, that it was over, that she was safe and would remain safe, and that she would never have to think about those men again. She looked at him for a long time when he said that, because she wasn't foolish. She had never once in her life been foolish, and she understood, almost completely, what kind of man could make a threat like that simply evaporate overnight, and what that meant about the world he moved within. And she said softly that perhaps she should be more afraid of him than she was, and he agreed that yes, perhaps she should be, but she only answered that all her life, dangerous men had always been dangerous toward her, while he was the first one who had stood between her and the danger instead of being the danger himself, and that was the night he stopped thinking of her as someone he was helping, and began to understand that she was someone he couldn't afford to lose. He told her the rest the following night, inside the car, when the danger of the past few days had finally receded behind them, and there was at last enough time for the kind of truth that couldn't be hurried. He told her that the object she had worn around her neck for all those years, the pattern that had drained the color from his face in the middle of the ballroom, wasn't a coincidence. And then he told her about his grandfather, a man named Cormac Gallagher, who had crossed the ocean from Ireland with nothing in his hands and built an entire life on the Boston docks during the years when the harbor was still the kind of place where a man could disappear into it or be made to disappear by someone else. He told her that his grandfather had been a hard man, a man whose name could silence other men inside a room. But there was one thing about the old man that all the stories along the docks had always left out, something Ronan himself hadn't fully understood until he was grown and had begun, without intending to do exactly what his grandfather had once done. All that quiet power, all the fear Cormac carried into rooms where fear was a form of currency, he had spent most of it in secret on people who could never repay him and who would never even know his name. Ronan told her that the old man had done it throughout his strange and lengthy life, a widow whose rent was mysteriously paid, a family whose home had burned to the ground, finding an envelope of money without a note among the ashes of the worst week of their lives, and he had done it so quietly that half of South Boston believed Cormac Gallagher was nothing more than a hardened smuggler, without ever realizing he was the closest thing to a saint who carried a club. Ronan told her that once, when he was only 8 years old, he had asked his grandfather why he kept it hidden. Why, if he was doing something good, he didn't allow people to thank him. And the old man, sitting on the pier mending a net, hadn't looked up when he answered that the moment they thanked you. Son, it stopped being about them and became about you, that a gift bearing your name was no longer a gift but a bill, and that if you wanted to help someone, you should help them and then disappear. Let them believe it was luck, or heaven, or the mercy of strangers, so that instead of giving them another debt to carry, you gave them the only thing worth giving, the feeling that the world could sometimes be kind for no reason at all. Then Ronan told her that there had been one winter, before he was born or when he was still too young to remember, when a family had stood on the edge of losing everything, when the cold had reached into their bones, when there was nothing left to burn and nothing left to eat, and his grandfather had done exactly what he always did, quietly and completely, then left the grandmother of that family a small piece of silver jewelry, in his own way, so that after the winter had passed and they had reached the other side, they would have something to hold in their hands, something that told them someone had believed they were worth saving, without ever having to know that it came with a name or a debt. He looked at the small pattern resting in her open palm and told her that the grandmother had been her grandmother, Della, that his family had carried her family through a brutal winter before the night she handed him the thing that would save 100 other families, that she hadn't known, he hadn't known, that the old man had set all of this in motion before either of them was old enough to remember, and that it had traveled in a full circle to return that night, inside a ballroom, through a spilled glass of champagne. Della cried then, pressing the piece of silver to her lips, and whispered the sentence she had carried for 20 years without understanding what it meant, that a hard man had done a gentle thing. That was what her grandmother had called him, and it had been his grandfather all along. And tonight it had been Ronan, and she had given him that recording only because he had been kind to her for 30 seconds, never knowing that their two families had already been bound together before either of them was born, and that they had simply never possessed the story that would allow them to read that bond aloud. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most beautiful weeks of his life, and he was slow to understand why, because he had no pattern into which he could place them. He had known many relationships that were really transactions, a few that were wars, and one, long ago, that had been a slow drowning he had mistaken for love until the water rose over his head in the rain. But he had no experience at all with what was happening between him and Della, the simple thing of two people gradually discovering that they liked the companionship of truth in one another. She refused to let him pay for anything, and it left him in a state of confusion that Maeve found endlessly amusing. He owned an entire harbor, yet he couldn't buy this woman dinner. She insisted on paying her share at restaurants where her portion was a serious wound to a budget he could erase with a single keystroke. And when he tried once to quietly pay the entire bill, she looked at him across the table with an expression that stopped him cold and said, "Ronan, if you turn me into someone you take care of, then we're finished. Because men have taken care of me all my life, and every one of them was really only taking care of himself, that she would accept his company. She would accept his honesty, but she would never accept his wallet, because the day she needed his wallet was the day she would have to begin owing him, and she was finished owing men simply because they had managed not to hurt her. So he let her pay her share, and he had never respected anyone more, and he realized that Maeve had been right about the fortress, that he had built walls designed to keep out exactly the kind of person who couldn't be bought, and now Della was there, having entered through a spilled glass of champagne, stubbornly refusing on principle to be impressed by the one thing around which he had built his entire identity. Then one evening beside the water, she told him something he had never expected, something that folded the whole story into a single sentence. She said that she had known that night at the gala, even before she gave him the recording. He asked what she had known, and she turned to look at him with something in her eyes that was both shy and immense, and said that she had known who he was, not because of the harbor, not because of the numbers, because she hadn't known anything about those things, but when Fitch bowed to him, when the deputy mayor crossed the room to reach him, she had connected enough to understand. She had known he was the most powerful man in the building, and perhaps the most dangerous too. She wasn't foolish. She had seen the men standing in the corners. She knew what it looked like when quiet men were watching a room for someone. She said that she could have lowered her head, because that was what people like her did near men like him. They lowered their heads and survived. But she had deliberately given the recording to the most frightening man in the room, knowing exactly what kind of man he might be, because he had defended her over a spilled glass of wine when there was nothing in it for him, when he didn't know her name and never expected to see her again, when she was only furniture. She said she had watched him spend his one moment of attention in that glittering golden room, protecting a waitress he would never meet again, and she had thought, this isn't a man made only of danger, so she had placed the greatest wager of her life on a stranger because of 30 seconds in which he had been kind when kindness could buy him nothing. Then she smiled, her eyes wet but steady in the way they always were, and said, I didn't fall in love with the harbor, Ronan. I didn't even know about the harbor. I fell in love with the man who was kind to me before he had any reason to be. And that, he understood, as he sat beside the dark water, was the whole difference. The difference he had needed 8 years and an empire to learn, while she had taught it to him with nothing more than a spilled glass of wine and a truth spoken softly beside the water. They were married the following spring, quietly, in the same way they had always done the things that truly mattered. There would be no gala. That was the first thing they agreed upon, laughing together as they said it. Both of them. No ballroom, no crystal chandeliers as large as automobiles, no 800 people performing their own importance at the very limits of their voices. They married on the wooden deck overlooking the harbor, with only a dozen or so people present, people who were genuine, while the water did what it always did during a Boston spring, unable to decide whether it wanted to be gray or gold and therefore choosing both at once. Della wore a simple dress and no jewelry except one piece, her sister's silver charm, the Gallagher family crest hanging from its faded green wool cord, the small piece of silver that had traveled through 2 decades and through the hands of so many people his grandfather had helped, only to return at last to the very family that had placed it in her grandmother's hands during a winter before either of them was born. Now resting against the beating of her heart, finally home, Maeve cried while pretending she wasn't crying. The foundation created from the ruins of Brannock's empire now returned money to the very people he had robbed, and Della ran it. She was better at the work than anyone Ronan could ever have hired, because she was the only person in the building who had truly stood on the other side of that door, inside a cramped room, counting money that refused to grow, waiting for a knock to come. She changed the way the foundation operated during her very first month. She said the paperwork had been designed by people who had never once needed the money themselves, that it treated everyone who came seeking help as though they were suspects, and that she wouldn't run a place that made a struggling family feel as though they were begging. So now, when a family entered, the first thing that happened was that someone sat beside them and offered them real coffee in a real cup, and the second thing that happened was that no one demanded they explain or justify themselves. On one wall of her office, Della hung photographs, not of donors, but of the families who had given her permission, photographs in which most of the children were smiling, a boy holding his graduation diploma high above his head, 2 little girls in the middle of a school play caught in the exact moment they burst into laughter, a long line of bright young faces gathered at a birthday party the foundation had quietly helped make possible. Cake everywhere, joy everywhere, the ordinary and noisy happiness of children who had no idea they had ever been in danger, which was exactly the way both Della and Ronan's grandfather would have wanted it. On some mornings, Ronan still stood on the wooden deck overlooking the water with a cup of coffee slowly growing cold in his hand. A habit she had given him along with everything else, and he thought about the man he had been in the rain 8 years earlier, and he understood that the Empire had never made him worthy. It had only made him safe. Worth was something entirely different, and it didn't cost a fortune. It cost 30 seconds of kindness inside a room where no one was watching, and it repaid him for the rest of his life. If you have ever been treated like furniture in someone else's gilded room, if you have ever lowered your head and survived, if every powerful person who passed through your life betrayed you, and yet you still emerged from it all with a heart that remained pure instead of bitter, then remember that the loudest people, the ones who insist on measuring your worth and declaring you beneath them, are almost always the emptiest, and you must never waste your fire warming their hands, nor spend your entire life waiting for them to decide whether you are worthy, because a person's true value has never lived in the noise made by others. It lives in the quiet kindness you give when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like so we know you are listening, and don't forget to share it with someone who may need to be reminded that their kindness has never been meaningless. Please also subscribe to our channel so that each day we can continue listening together to more meaningful and captivating stories. We would truly love to know how you feel about Della and Ronan's story, and which part of their journey moved you most. So please leave a comment and share the feelings that come from deep within your heart, because we sincerely treasure hearing your voice. May everyone watching this video always be blessed with good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. And we'll see you again in the next video.